talk today is going to be on the Taints. And we had a retreat recently here at MABA for teachers and those who have taken their bodies off the vows. And Master Jiru gave a talk that weekend on the Taints. So I'm doing my own version today. As you might guess from the name, taints are unwanted things. A taint is something that spoils something good, like a stain or rot. Master Jiru referred us to a sutta called All the Taints, and this is from the middle-length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya. It's the second sutta. And it's basically about all the various ways we can overcome our most serious problems, the obstacles to our spiritual practice and development. So Master's talk really intrigued me and left me curious to learn more and think more about this sutta. And so I decided that that's why I would give this talk today. So some of you are familiar with the topic, but I imagine many of you are not. So first I'll say something about what the taints are. The Pali name is asava, which can also be translated as fermentations, corruptions, intoxicant biases. So, sometimes we see the term canker, a kind of sore or infection. Intoxicant biases suggests a more contemporary term, addictions. Fermentations is an interesting term because Bhante Gunaratana, who's familiar to some of you from his books on meditation, he has a YouTube video of a Dharma talk he gave on the Taints. You can find it if you Google All the Taints, Bhante Gunaratana. And he said that these taints have been brewing in our subconscious minds since time immemorial. He also says that we need to take them very seriously because they are the root of all of our problems. They need to be destroyed. And he emphasizes that that was the Buddha's own term. Because the asavas are so destructive themselves. They're destructive of morality, of concentration, of wisdom, of our very spiritual practice. So what are these taints, the asavas? There are 3 of them, sometimes 4 of them. The 4th was thought to be a more recent addition to the original text. First is sensual pleasure or desire. The second is the desire for being or non-being. It's basically that self-view. Third, and this is probably the more recent addition, is wrong views. The idea that my view is best. And the 4th one is ignorance, essentially ignorance of the Dharma, or in particular the Four Noble Truths. According to Bhante Gunaratana, we can view ourselves as victims of the taints because they arise. Of course, we don't will them into being. They arise conditioned by our sense impressions. They're extremely powerful and dominating. Again, Bhante Ji connects the taints or asavas to the term bhava, which means becoming. And bhava is part of the process of dependent co-origination, or the wheel of samsara that keeps us on an unending round of suffering, death, and return. So the taints prepare us for each next moment, or next existence, however we want to think about it. They condition us. There's even the term kamasava, which means preparing our consciousness or karma. So the 3 or 4 taints are interrelated and reinforce each other, which appears pretty obvious when we think about it. For example, when I suffer from ignorance, then I also certainly place the wrong value on sense pleasures. And I also cling to my own selfhood. It's very hard for me to shake my conviction of my inherent existence. And what determines our ability to overcome the taints, the Buddha says in the sutta, is our ability to see the difference between wise attention and unwise attention. And this ability is in turn strengthened by practicing 7 different strategies for destroying the taints given to us in this sutta by the Buddha. And these strategies, which I will say more about individually, are seeing, restraining, using, enduring, avoiding, removing, and developing. Seeing and developing, the first and last, seem to me the biggest and perhaps most important or most advanced of the 7 strategies. If you think about it, the first one, seeing, if we don't see, how can we act? So the passage on abandoning taints by seeing begins by pointing out that, in the words of the sutta, an untaught, ordinary person who has no regard for noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dharma, who has no regard for true men and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dharma, does not understand what things are fit for attention and what things are unfit for attention. Since that is so, he attends to those things unfit for attention, and he does not attend to those things fit for attention. The passage in the sutta describes how a person attends unwisely, thus giving rise to the taints. That person thinks thoughts like these. Was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Having been what did I become in the past? Shall I be in the future? Shall I not be in the future? What shall I be in the future? How shall I be in the future? Having been what shall I become in the future? Or else he is inwardly perplexed about the present, thus, am I not? What am I? How am I? Where has this being come from? Where will it go? With questions like these, we are giving attention to unwise thoughts or questions. And what happens then? The sutta continues. When he attends unwisely in this way, one of 6 views arises in him. The view, self exists for me, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, no self exists for me, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive self with self, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive not self with self, arises in him as true and established. Or the view, I perceive self with not self, arises in him as true and established. Or else he has some such view as this. It is this self of mine that speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions, but this self of mine is permanent, everlasting, eternal, not subject to change, and it will endure as long as eternity. These speculations about selfhood are called a thicket of views, implying that, like a thicket of brambles, they'll get us caught up and tangled in them. They do not lead, the Buddha tells us, to liberation from suffering. Instead, with these kinds of thoughts, the taints arise in us, and their existence deep in our consciousness is strengthened. So how do we attend wisely? To what do we devote our attention so that the taints are abandoned or destroyed? The Buddha refers us to his most fundamental teaching of the Four Noble Truths. Quote, he attends wisely, this is suffering. He attends wisely, This is the origin of suffering. He attends wisely. This is the cessation of suffering. He attends wisely. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This concludes the passage on how to destroy the taints by seeing. I think particularly the taint of ignorance, and also clearly the taint of being. This strategy should remind us of the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path, right view. Because right view is also defined as seeing or realizing the Four Noble Truths. That suffering exists for us all, that suffering originates in our clinging to existence and to our likes and dislikes, that suffering does have an end, and that the ending of suffering is achieved by following a path, the Noble Eightfold Path. So we see that right view and attending wisely by seeing are one and the same strategy. Next, the sutta describes how to overcome the taints by restraining. What do we restrain? The 6 sense bases: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. In other words, we restrain our 5 bodily senses and our mental sense through the exercise of mindfulness. This mindfulness keeps us from being seduced by sense objects, whether they are sights, sounds, tastes, smells, tactile sensations, or thoughts. There are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who abides with the faculties restrained, the sutta tells us. But when we are seduced by the senses, because they are unrestrained by mindfulness, then we experience the taints, we experience vexation or dissatisfaction, and the fever of craving. Bhante Ji adds to this the importance of moral restraint, which we practice by keeping the precepts. There are the 5 precepts suitable for all people: not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to engage in sexual misconduct, and not to become intoxicated. And monastics and bodhisattvas have additional precepts to follow. Next, we are told about abandoning the taints by using. How often do we think about how we use things? We live in a consumerist society, so we're constantly using stuff, and thereby using up the earth. But even in the Buddha's time, he felt it necessary to teach his disciples the benefit of using possessions wisely and mindfully. The bhikkhus lived a very simple life with very few possessions. And these are specifically mentioned in the sutta. They have the robe, they have alms food, the resting place, and medicines. These are the most basic physical needs of all humans: food, clothing, shelter, and remedies for sickness. Think about how far we have expanded this list of basics to a plethora of supermarkets and restaurants, dizzying choices of clothing to buy and wear, not to mention the fashion industry, McMansions to live in, plus an entire industry offering storage rental for the stuff we can't fit in our McMansions. And how could the medicinal remedies available in the Buddha's time compare with our drug industries, the vitamin supplement industry, but also personal care items, gyms, personal trainers, etc., etc.? What was the Buddha's advice with regard to using our basic possessions? He says, a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, uses the robe only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things, and only for the purpose of concealing the private parts. Reflecting wisely, he uses alms food neither for amusement, nor for intoxication, nor for the sake of physical beauty and attractiveness, but only for the endurance and continuance of this body, for enduring discomfort, for ending discomfort, and for assisting the holy life, considering, thus I shall terminate old feelings without arousing new feelings, and I shall be healthy and blameless and shall live in comfort. And we use much the same words in the meditation we chant before lunch here at MABA, so it's familiar to many of us. Now we know where it comes from. The Buddha goes on, reflecting wisely, he uses the resting place only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind and sun and creeping things, and only for the purpose of warding off the perils of climate and for enjoying retreat. Reflecting wisely, he uses the medicinal requisites only for protection from arisen, afflicting feelings, illness, and for the benefit of good health. So we too should use our medicines for relieving pain and to improve health. And again, the Buddha promises that by using wisely, we will free ourselves from the taints, from suffering, and from the fever of craving. So I think that the message to us, in essence, is to live simply, to be mindful before we acquire and buy more stuff to use. Taints to be abandoned by enduring comes next. So, despite the protection of your robe and shelter and your medicines that you've used wisely, life will still throw up to us various disagreeable situations. The bugs and creeping things will get under our clothes. We can't escape the worst of the heat and cold. We get sick, and as with the common cold, there's nothing to do but wait until it runs its course. Or people may speak unkindly or harshly to us, may slander us, or we may meet with other kinds of misfortune. What do these things have to do with the taints? A lot, apparently, because the Buddha says we are to use these occurrences as opportunities to defeat the taints by enduring them with patience. If we will not endure them patiently, we'll suffer even more. Our craving for relief will overcome us. Our self-protection and self-cherishing will come to the fore, and the taint of being will be strengthened. The word patience is not used in the sutta, but I think it's implied. I think we all know from experience that there's no endurance without patience. Avoiding is the next strategy given by the Buddha. And this, to me, was at first glance the most surprising one, especially as it follows after enduring. The sutta advises this: a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, avoids a wild elephant, a wild horse, a wild bull, a wild dog, a snake, a stump, a bramble patch, a chasm, a cliff, a cesspit, a sewer. Reflecting wisely, he avoids sitting on unsuitable seats, wandering to unsuitable resorts, and associating with bad friends, since if he were to do so, wise companions in the holy life might suspect him of evil conduct. So, there is an interesting variety of things which we are advised to avoid, ranging from obvious dangers like wild animals, not such a common threat in our contemporary lives, but also stumps, bramble patches, chasms, cliffs, objects that would hurt us physically if we were to come in too close contact with them. Also cesspits and sewers, obvious sources, especially in the Buddha's time, I suppose, but also in many developing countries, sources for disease. So we are to mindfully avoid these dangers. We are to take reasonable care of our bodies and not put them into situations of unnecessary danger. I see this advice as as a kind of amendment to balance the strategy of enduring, so that we don't neglect our health and well-being, just thinking that we should simply endure everything, even dangers and sources of disease. No, the Buddha tells us, do your best to avoid dangers and threats to your well-being. Endure what you cannot avoid or escape. The last advice, to avoid sitting on unsuitable seats, wandering to unsuitable resorts, and associating with bad friends. I'm not sure what the Buddha had in mind for unsuitable seats. I suspect it was something more than an unstable, broken chair. Perhaps something to do with status, not sitting on too high a seat or grand a seat. Unsuitable resorts for us could be places that lead to lack of restraint or to risky behavior, like bars or gambling casinos, shopping malls. Associating with bad friends is pretty obvious. And I have to insert a little anecdote here because it came to me and it was something very funny that happened a long time ago, but I hope you see the relevance. There was an official in Ireland whom we heard giving a talk on how to successfully open and run a B&B. And he advised that the kitchen facility should be quite separate from the breakfast room. And the reason was that, in his words, if you dropped a piece of bacon on the floor, your guests couldn't accuse you of putting it back on the plate. The Buddha warns the bhikkhus that if they associate with bad friends, their wise friends might suspect them of evil conduct. The point being that that would not be an unreasonable assumption or suspicion. The next passage in the sutta involves taints to be abandoned by removing. And here we turn to inner states. The previous strategies had a lot to do with our physical behavior, right? This one advises that a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. He abandons it, removes it, does away with it, and annihilates it. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of cruelty. He does not tolerate arisen evil, unwholesome states. He abandons them, removes them, does away with them, and annihilates them. To follow the Buddha's advice, we contemporary disciples should be mindful of when we fall prey to the poisons of greed, when we can't control our desire for unnecessary food, drink, inappropriate sex, drugs. When these thoughts arise, we must not feed them with more thinking. I always think that Pema Chodron has really good advice for dealing with situations like these, in which she advises leaving aside the narrative associated with these impulses or thoughts and just sitting with the physical sensations so that we don't suppress our desires, but we can dissolve or liberate them by remaining with the bodily sensations, watching them arise and fall away. Similarly, with thoughts of ill will or cruelty, our aggressive or hateful impulses, a good antidote is to practice metta, loving kindness, toward ourselves and toward the person about whom we're having these thoughts. Metta is a specific practice for those of you who may be newcomers, of extending thoughts of loving kindness, happiness, peacefulness to other beings and to ourselves. And that practice is actually included in our chanting booklet, so I think it's in this month, and we'll chant it in a little while. Evil, unwholesome states can also include, I would think, depressed thoughts toward myself, feelings of unworthiness, of self-hate, of worthlessness. If these don't extend to the stage of clinical depression, for which they may require medical treatment, we might try relieving them with metta practice toward ourselves. So we see that the removing strategy requires mindfulness of our inner emotions and thoughts. Finally, we come to the last strategy, that of developing. The Buddha says, here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, develops the mindfulness enlightenment factor. He develops the investigation enlightenment factor, the energy enlightenment factor, the rapture enlightenment factor, the tranquility enlightenment factor, the concentration enlightenment factor, the equanimity enlightenment factor. And this is a listing of the 7 factors of enlightenment, or bojjhanga in Pali, which is derived from the roots bodhi, which means enlightened, and anga, meaning limbs or factors. In another teaching, the Buddha compared the 7 factors to a peaked roof. He said, just as monks in a peaked house, all rafters whatsoever go together to the peak, slopes to the peak, join in the peak, and of all, the peak is reckoned chief. Even so, the monk who cultivates and makes much of these 7 factors of wisdom slopes to nibbana, inclines to nibbana, tends to nibbana. The Buddha also adds that the 7 enlightenment factors are supported by seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, and that they ripen in relinquishment. So we see that they are very much associated with meditation practice and make a very appropriate culminating strategy for destroying the taints. Just to sum up then, the taints: sensual desire, being, wrong views, and ignorance are deeply rooted karmic tendencies in us that keep us in samsara and the round of suffering. The Buddha has given us 7 strategies: seeing, restraining, using, enduring, avoiding, removing, and developing, which when practiced will uproot and destroy the taints in us. When a person has abandoned all the taints, the Buddha says, then he is called a bhikkhu who dwells restrained with the restraint of all the taints. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, he has made an end of suffering. By conceit is meant self-conceit, or the taint of being. This discourse on the taints, or asavas, is a very important one. It is completely relevant to us today and offers wonderful advice for becoming aware of these obstacles to our spiritual development. And once aware of them, how to counteract them and free ourselves from them. I wish that all of us here and all beings everywhere may benefit from our hearing and learning this sutta and putting it into practice. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free of suffering. May all beings be liberated. Thank you.